I had a purpose before, to find my sister.
We have to go. We have to find her.
If you marry me, you can touch me whenever you want, whispered the Apache beauty on their wedding night. The wind was a constant companion in this high, lonely country, a sculptor that had shaped the man as much as it had the rock and twisted juniper. Elijah Calloway moved through his days with the same deliberate economy of motion he saw in the hawks that circled overhead. There was no wasted energy, no hurried gesture. His world was a small cabin of his own felling, a lean-to for his mule, and a well he had dug until his hands were raw monuments to the effort. The land stretched out in every direction, a vast, indifferent canvas of ochre and sagebrush under a sky that was too big, too empty. He had come here to be swallowed by that emptiness, to let it scour him clean of a past that was all noise and blood and loss. The lines etched around his eyes were from squinting into the sun, not from laughter. He worked from the first hint of gray light until the last embers of sunset bled from the western horizon. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a kind of prayer. He mended the fences that kept nothing in and everything out. He cleaned his rifle with a focus that bordered on reverence. Each night before he barred the door, he would stand on his small porch and scan the horizon, a ritual as ingrained as breathing. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply watching, a sentinel at the edge of the world, guarding a life that consisted of little more than silence and survival. The past had taught him that trouble rarely announced itself. It came on quiet feet, a shadow slipping through the twilight, and by the time you saw it, it was already at your throat. So he watched. The habit was all that remained of the man he used to be, a prospector whose world had been defined by clear perimeters and the constant threat of their breach. Here the perimeter was the horizon itself, an impossible distance to guard. Yet he guarded it all the same. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. It was on one of these evenings, with the air cooling and the sky turning a deep, bruised purple, that his vigil was rewarded. A flicker of movement, wrong and out of place in the landscape's slow rhythm. It was not the lope of a coyote or the darting of a jackrabbit. It was human, and it was struggling. He grabbed his rifle, the cold weight of the stock, a familiar comfort in his palm, and moved from the porch, melting into the landscape as if he were born of it. He circled wide, using the terrain for cover, his steps making no sound on the hard-packed earth. The silence was absolute, save for the whisper of the wind. He found her collapsed at the edge of a dry wash a mile from his cabin. She was a tangle of black hair and torn buckskin, her body curled in on itself, a gesture of either pain or self-preservation. He stayed in the shadows of the rocks for a long time, watching. She did not move. Her stillness was profound, the stillness of something that had run to the very end of its strength. He could see the dark, ugly bruise swelling on her cheek, the dried blood that crusted her temple. Her feet were bare, torn, and bleeding. He saw the tracks leading to her, and the tracks that followed. 3 shod horses moving with purpose. They were hunters. He looked back at the woman, crow by her features and the remnants of her dress. She was alone, astray, and the men who followed her were not the kind to show mercy. A deep, cold knot tightened in his gut. It was the feeling he had come here to escape, the pull of a world he had tried to leave behind. He could turn back, he could walk away, bar his door, and let the wilderness reclaim its own. It was not his fight. He had sworn off other people's fights, sworn off the pain that came with caring. His hands, though, they remembered the heft of a pickaxe, the hopeful glint of gold, and the sudden, sickening void when a world built on that hope collapsed. He had been a man of ambition, of a full heart, and the Wild West had taken it all, first his claim, then his partner, and finally his spirit. The memory of that loss, sharp and cold as a winter wind, was a cage he had built around himself, a fortress of solitude. He had convinced himself that this emptiness, this silent, desolate land, was all he deserved. He was a man who had lost everything because he had dared to have something, and now, this struggling, wounded woman was a ghost from that old life. a living reminder that the world was still full of people in need, of battles that were not his own, and of a risk he had sworn never to take again. He saw the faint, shallow rise and fall of her back. She was alive, a spark of life in a landscape of death. He lowered his rifle slightly, a concession to a choice he had already made. He stepped out from the rocks, his movements slow and deliberate, making sure his hands were visible. He did not call out. He simply approached, his presence a quiet fact on the land. He stopped a dozen feet away. Her eyes snapped open. They were black, deep, and filled with a fierce, cornered terror. She scrambled backward, pushing herself up with one arm, her body tensing to run, to fight, to die. He saw in that instant that she was not a victim waiting for rescue. She was a survivor, and her pride was a blade she would turn on him as readily as on her pursuers. Elijah stopped again. He slowly unslung the canteen from his shoulder, uncorked it, and set it on the ground between them. Then he backed away, retreating to a respectful distance, and sat on a rock. He said nothing. He simply waited, his face unreadable, his posture that of a man with all the time in the world. The sun had set, and the chill of the desert night began to creep in. The silence stretched thin and taut. It was a language they both understood. He did not look directly at her, but watched her from the corner of his eye. He could see the struggle within her, the primal need for water against the equally primal fear of the man who offered it. Her gaze darted from the canteen to his still form, then to the darkening landscape, searching for an escape that did not exist. Finally, her thirst won. She moved with a pained slowness, a hand pressed to her ribs, and crawled toward the canteen. She snatched it up as if it might be a trap, her eyes never leaving him. She drank in short, desperate gulps, the water spilling down her chin. When she was done, she threw the canteen back towards him, an act of defiance, not gratitude. It landed in the dust with a dull thud. Elijah gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He stood, retrieved the canteen, and turned to walk back toward his cabin, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she had no other choice. The tracks of the three riders were a clear warning, and the open country was a death sentence for a woman on foot, injured and alone. His cabin was the only sanctuary for miles. He walked steadily, not slowing his pace, trusting her own survival instinct to guide her. He could hear her footsteps behind him, a faint shuffling sound in the dirt, the sound of agony and exhaustion. When he reached the cabin, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, leaving it ajar. The single room was spare and clean, dominated by a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a cot. A fire was already laid in the hearth, waiting for a match. He lit the oil lamp on the table, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. He moved to the hearth and struck a match, the flame catching the dry kindling with a hungry crackle. He did not speak. He moved about the small space, his actions measured and functional. He poured water from a bucket into a small basin, took a clean cloth from a chest, and placed them on the table. He took a tin of salve from a shelf. He set out a plate and a cup, then turned to the fire to hang a small pot of water to boil. Only then did he turn to face the doorway. She stood there, a silhouette against the last of the twilight, poised on the threshold as if it were a cliff edge. Her fear was a palpable thing in the small room, a wild energy that filled the space between them. She remained in the doorway for a long time, her body tensed, her dark eyes tracking his every move. Elijah ignored her, focusing on his tasks. He added dried herbs to the boiling water, the steam carrying a clean, medicinal scent. He tore a strip from another clean cloth for a bandage. He moved without urgency, his calmness a silent message. I am not a threat. Finally, as the night chill deepened, she took a hesitant step inside, and then another, pulling the heavy door closed behind her. The sound of the bar sliding into place was deafeningly loud in the quiet cabin. She did not come closer to the fire, but flattened herself against the wall near the door, choosing the position with the clearest escape route. Elijah looked at her then. He gestured with his chin toward the chair at the table. It was not a command, but an invitation. She stared at him, her expression a mask of distrust. He saw the pride in the straight line of her back, the defiance that warred with the exhaustion plain on her face. He turned away from her again, giving her space. He took a bowl from the shelf and ladled some thin broth into it from a pot simmering by the fire. He placed the bowl on the table next to the basin of water and the salve. He did not look at her again. He took his own bowl, sat on a low stool by the hearth, with his back mostly to her, and began to eat. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. He ate slowly, methodically. When he was finished, he set his bowl aside. He waited. He could feel her watching him, her gaze, a physical weight on his shoulders. He heard a faint scrape as the chair was pulled out. He heard the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl. She was eating. The small sound was a victory, a first crack in the wall of her terror. He did not turn. He gave her the privacy of his back, allowing her this moment of vulnerability without the pressure of his observation. When he heard the spoon set down, he rose. He took the basin of warm herb-infused water and the cloth and placed them on the floor near her, along with the tin of salve and the clean bandage. "For your feet," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the words simple and direct. He did not wait for a response. He took his rifle, a blanket, and went to the door. He laid the blanket on the floor, sat down with his back against the wood, and placed the rifle across his lap. He was a sentinel once more, his post now the threshold of his own home. He would sleep there, a guardian between her and the vast, dangerous night. He heard her hesitant movements behind him, the soft splash of water, a sharp intake of breath as she cleaned her wounds, and then there was only the sound of the fire and the wind, and the shared watchful silence. Days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Elijah would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb her. He would go out to tend to the mule and check the perimeter of his property, his eyes always scanning, always watchful. When he returned, she would be awake, the blanket on the cot folded neatly, her presence in the small cabin as unobtrusive as a shadow. She never spoke. At first, she simply watched him, her gaze intense and analytical, as if she were memorizing his every habit, trying to understand the nature of the man who had taken her in. He gave her no cause for alarm. He moved around her with a quiet respect for her space, never crowding her, never making a sudden move. He would leave food for her on the table and then busy himself with chores outside. He mended a broken hinge on the corral, patched a hole on the cabin roof, split a mountain of firewood. He worked with a relentless, steady pace, his labor a testament to his self-sufficiency. After the third day, she began to move from the corner she had claimed as her own. She took the bowls to the wash basin and cleaned them. The next day, she swept the floor with a broom she found by the hearth. They were small gestures, but in the silence of the cabin, they were as loud as declarations. She was not a guest. She was contributing, claiming a small piece of this life, asserting her own worth. One afternoon, he came inside to find her mending a tear in one of his shirts with a needle and thread from his small supply kit. Her stitches were small and precise, her hands, though bruised and cut, moving with a practiced skill. He stopped in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She did not look up, but he knew she was aware of his presence. He gave a single slow nod of approval and went back outside. The unspoken communication between them was becoming a language of its own. A piece of fresh bread left on the table was a gesture of provision. A bucket of water filled and brought inside was an act of partnership. A mended shirt was an expression of gratitude. They were building something fragile and tentative in the space between them, a structure made of shared tasks and mutual respect rather than words. He began to see the resilience that lay beneath her fear. He saw the pride in the way she held herself, the intelligence in her observant eyes. She was not broken, despite what she had endured. She was a survivor, forged in a fire he could only imagine. And he found, to his own surprise, that her silent presence was a comfort. The profound loneliness of the place seemed to lessen. The cabin felt less like an outpost and more like a home. The silence was no longer empty. it was shared. For the first time since his old life had been shattered, a different kind of warmth began to creep into his chest. It wasn't the fleeting heat of a fever, but a slow, persistent glow. He had lived in a world of stark lines and clear boundaries, a world where the only thing you could trust was the dirt under your boots. He had been a man of solitude, a fortress built against the pain of attachment. And yet, this woman, with her quiet strength and her bruised hands, was chipping away at his walls, not with force, but with the gentle, rhythmic tap of small, silent acts. He found himself looking forward to coming inside, to the sight of her working by the firelight, her shadow moving across the rough-hewn walls. He had never considered a life with another person. It had seemed an impossible fragility, a vulnerability he could not afford. But with her here, the silence wasn't a void to be endured. It was a sanctuary to be cherished. He found himself noticing the way the firelight caught in her dark hair, the slight lift of her lips when she found a task to do, the subtle way her shoulders relaxed when she knew he wasn't watching. These were the things that made a place, a home, not just a shelter. He had been a ghost haunting his own life, a man without a future, only a past. She was the anchor he didn't know he needed, a quiet, unwavering presence that told him, without a single word, that a future was possible. A future with the weight of shared burdens and the light of a shared fire. He was beginning to understand that the deepest loneliness was not the absence of people, but the absence of connection. And in this small cabin, a connection was being forged. A silent, powerful bond, born of mutual need and unspoken respect. He was starting to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, his heart wasn't made of stone after all. It was made of copper, waiting to be heated and molded into something new, something that could finally feel again. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. The intrusion came on the 5th day. Elijah was sharpening his axe blade on a wet stone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound in the clear morning air, when he heard the horses. It was the sound he had been listening for, the one he had been expecting. He looked up, his hand still on the axe, and saw 3 riders cresting the low ridge to the east. They were moving at a confident, unhurried pace, their postures arrogant. Kaya was inside the cabin. He had only a moment. He rose, his movements unhurried, and walked to the cabin door. He pushed it open and looked at her. Her eyes were wide, the old fear returning. He simply pointed to the small root cellar. Its door, a set of heavy wooden planks, set into the cabin floor. She understood immediately. Without a word, she moved to it, lifted the heavy door, and slipped into the darkness below. He closed it over her, kicked a dusty rug over the seams, and then turned to face the riders, the axe still held loosely in his hand. He stood on the porch, waiting as they reined in before him. The man in the lead was broad and bearded, with small, cruel eyes set in a fleshy face. A tarnished silver star was pinned to his vest, but it was a prop, a cheap justification for the gun on his hip. His name was Malachi, and he dealt in flesh and pain. "Morning," Malachi said, his voice a greasy drawl. His eyes roamed over the small homestead, assessing, calculating. "Looking for someone?" Elijah said nothing. He leaned the axe against the porch railing and crossed his arms, his expression flat and uninviting. "Seen a crow squaw. Ran off from our transport." Malachi lied easily, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Worth a decent bounty. Pretty thing for a savage. Long black hair, mean as a snake." He grinned, revealing stained teeth. Elijah's gaze remained steady. "Haven't seen anyone." Malachi's eyes narrowed, shifting from Elijah to the cabin. He sniffed the air. "Smells like someone's been cooking for 2. "I eat a lot," Elijah said, his voice a low rumble. One of Malachi's men, a lanky youth with a nervous tic, shifted in his saddle. "We tracked her right to this valley, Malachi." Malachi's gaze hardened. He swung down from his horse, his boots thudding in the dirt. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Malachi moved, not with a draw of a gun, but with the sudden predatory grace of a man who knew he held all the power. He advanced on the porch, his eyes burning with a cruel certainty. "You're lying, prospector," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I can smell her. Smell the fear on her." Elijah didn't flinch. He just stood there, a rock in the face of a rising tide. He had faced men like this before, men who hid their cowardice behind a badge and a gun. They were the ones who had taken his claim, who had shot his partner in the back, who had left him with nothing but a broken spirit and a copper heart. The memories flooded back, a bitter, cold river. He could feel the old rage, the impotent fury of a man who had lost everything because he had trusted the wrong people. But this time was different. This time, there was someone else to protect. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken threats. Malachi took another step, his hand now hovering over the butt of his pistol. "Move aside, and I won't make a mess of your little home." Elijah's response was a simple, brutal truth. "This is my home." The words hung in the air, a line drawn in the dust. Malachi's face contorted in a sneer. "Don't be a fool. She's just a savage, not worth your life." "You're wrong," Elijah said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a world-weary defiance. "She's worth more than all the gold you'll ever find." The words shocked even him. They were not a declaration of love, not yet, but a confession of a new, profound truth. He was no longer just a man guarding a patch of dirt. He was a man guarding a life, a hope, a fragile connection that had brought his heart back from the brink of a long, cold winter. Malachi's sneer vanished, replaced by a look of cold, calculating fury. He had expected a man to be cowed, to beg, to step aside for a few paltry dollars. Instead, he found a stubborn defiance, a quiet strength that was more dangerous than a loaded gun. Malachi slowly withdrew his pistol, the clicking sound loud in the tense air. "Fool's choices lead to a fool's grave," he said. The two other men dismounted, their guns now in their hands. The odds were impossible, 3-1. Elijah knew it. He had stared down these odds before and lost. The memory of his partner, face down in the dirt, came back to him, a ghost of a lesson he had learned the hard way. But he was not that man anymore. He was not alone. The sound of a heavy thump from inside the cabin, the root cellar door being pushed open, was all the warning he needed. He didn't look back. He just stood his ground, his eyes locked on Malachi's, a quiet, unshakable challenge. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and sagebrush. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment when he would either let his past consume him or stand and fight for a future he hadn't dared to imagine just a week ago. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." The moment broke. Malachi raised his gun, and the two other men followed suit. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Malachi filled the doorway, a pistol in each hand, his face contorted with rage. Behind him was the last of his men. They stormed in, expecting to find their target cowering. Instead, they were met with fire. Elijah shot from the right of the hearth, Kaya from the left. They fired in a steady, lethal rhythm. Malachi's remaining man went down in the first volley. Malachi himself staggered, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, but his sheer rage and momentum carried him forward. He raised a pistol, his eyes fixed on Elijah. Kaya fired again. The shot caught Malachi in the side. He grunted, his aim wavering. It was the opening Elijah needed. He lunged forward, not with his rifle, but with his body, crashing into the bigger man. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the fight devolving into something brutal and primitive. Malachi's gun went off, the bullet burying itself in the floorboards. Elijah drove the butt of his rifle into Malachi's face. The man grunted, stunned, and Elijah used the moment to roll free, coming up with the knife from his belt. The fight was over in seconds, a grim, silent struggle in the firelight. Then silence descended upon the cabin, a quiet so profound it was like a physical presence. The silence that followed the violence was heavy and suffocating. The only sounds were the ragged gasps of their own breathing and the soft, hungry crackle of the fire in the hearth. The cabin, their sanctuary, was a wreck. The door hung broken on one hinge. The window was a gaping hole, and the walls were scarred with bullet holes. The air was thick with the acid smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. Elijah stood over Malachi's body, his chest heaving, the knife still in his hand. He looked down at the man who had brought this destruction to his door. But he felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow emptiness. The violence had been a necessary, ugly thing, a storm that had to be weathered, and now the storm had passed. He looked over at Kaya. She was still crouched by the hearth, her rifle held in a white-knuckled grip, her eyes wide and fixed on the carnage. He saw the tremor in her hands, the shock beginning to set in. He walked over to her and gently took the rifle from her grasp. Her fingers were stiff, and he had to carefully uncurl them from the stock. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet. "We are safe." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She gave a slow, jerky nod, as if her body was just now remembering how to move. He saw a long, shallow gash on her arm where a splinter of wood had torn her skin. He turned, took the basin of water and a clean cloth, and knelt before her. Wordlessly, he began to clean the wound. His hands were gentle, his movements careful. She watched him, her breathing slowly returning to normal. As he worked, the reality of what they had just survived, what they had done together, settled over them. They had faced death and emerged on the other side. The bond they had formed in silence and trust had been consecrated by blood and gunpowder. It was real now, in a way that no ceremony could have ever made it. When he was finished cleaning the cut, he bandaged it with a strip of cloth. He did not speak, and neither did she. There were no words for what had passed between them. He stood and offered her a hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. They stood there for a moment in the ruined cabin, surrounded by the evidence of their shared battle. He looked from the wreckage to her face, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his life of solitude was over. He was no longer just a man on a piece of land. He was a partner, and this was their home. The first task was to deal with the dead. It was grim work, but necessary. He dragged the bodies outside, away from the cabin, while Kaya watched from the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. The night was cold now, and the stars seemed impossibly bright and distant, indifferent to the small, violent drama that had played out below them. By the time the sun rose, the grim task was done. Elijah had buried the men in a shallow grave far from the cabin, a final unmarked resting place in the wilderness they had sought to corrupt. He returned to the homestead as the sky began to lighten, a chill of the night still clinging to him. He was bone-weary, a deep exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. Kaya was waiting for him. She had a fire going, and the smell of coffee filled the air. She had swept the floor, clearing away the splinters and debris. She had found a piece of canvas and tacked it over the broken window, a temporary shield against the elements. She had already begun the process of reclaiming their home from the violence that had violated it. She handed him a tin cup of hot coffee as he walked in. Their hands brushed, and this time the touch lingered for a second longer than necessary. It was a small moment of shared comfort, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured. They drank their coffee in silence, watching the sun crest the ridge. The light spilled across the valley, painting the land in soft shades of gold and rose. It was a new day, a clean day. Later that morning, he began the repairs. He took the broken door from its hinges and set about mending the splintered wood. Kaya brought him the tools he needed without him having to ask. She worked beside him, her presence a quiet support. They moved in a comfortable, practiced rhythm, their shared labor a slow healing process. Mending the door, mending the walls, they were mending the breach in their lives, rebuilding their fortress. By midday, the door was rehung, scarred, but solid once more. In the afternoon, they rode out together on his mule, Elijah in the saddle and Kaya riding behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist. They went to check the snares he had set for rabbits. The simple domestic task felt profound. They were providing for their future, a future that was no longer his alone, but theirs. As they rode, he felt the warmth of her body against his back, a solid, living presence. He had spent years cultivating his solitude, believing it was all he wanted. He realized now how wrong he had been. He had not been living. He had been waiting. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable space filled with unspoken understanding. It was a silence built on shared experience, on trust earned in the face of death. As they returned to the cabin in the late afternoon with 2 rabbits for their dinner, the homestead looked different. It looked smaller, more vulnerable in the vast landscape, but it also looked like a bastion of safety, a small point of light and warmth in the wilderness. It was home. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. That night, after a meal that felt more like a celebration than a simple dinner, they sat by the fire. The cabin was clean and secure again. The scars remained, but they were now part of its story. Their story. Kaya looked at him, her expression soft in the firelight. "Elijah," she said, his name a quiet reassurance on her lips. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was not a gesture of desperation or payment. It was a simple, honest touch of connection, of partnership. "Thank you." He covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm enveloping her small fingers. "We protect our own," he said, and in those 3 words, he erased the lie of their separate lives and spoke the truth of their new family. The future was uncertain. The land was still harsh, but they would face it together. In the quiet of the small cabin, under the vast, star-filled sky, 2 solitary survivors had found their sanctuary, not in a place, but in each other. They were no longer 2 lone hearts, but one. But the past, for a man like Elijah and a woman like Kaya, was not so easily buried. The scars on the walls were a constant reminder, and the silence that had once been a comfort now held the echoes of gunfire. The feeling of safety was a fragile thing, a beautiful lie they had built with their bare hands. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah found a small, leather-bound pouch hidden beneath Kaya's pillow. He had been tidying the cot, a new habit he found himself developing, and the pouch fell into his hand. It was too light to be full of gold, too small for anything of real value, but its weight felt heavy with a secret. He hesitated for a long moment, the quiet trust they had built warring with the primal human need to know. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, was a small, perfectly carved stone arrowhead, obsidian black and sharp to the touch. Next to it was a lock of braided hair, a deep chestnut color, unlike her own. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, a sudden coldness creeping in. He felt a familiar knot of dread tightening in his gut, the same one he'd felt when he saw the 3 riders approaching. This wasn't a secret. This was a story she hadn't told him. The arrowhead, he knew from his days in the hills, was from a specific tribe, one that had been nearly wiped out in a massacre not a year ago. The hair, he didn't want to think about the hair. It was a memorial, a piece of a life, a family, that had been stolen. He heard the click of the door latch and quickly slipped the pouch back under the pillow, his hands trembling slightly. Kaya walked in, her face serene and peaceful after a walk in the cool evening air. She saw his strained expression, the haunted look in his eyes. She didn't have to ask. The pouch was a secret they had both been keeping, a ghost between them. She sat on the cot, her movements slow and deliberate, a silent invitation for him to ask the question he was too afraid to voice. He looked at her, at the woman who had fought beside him, who had trusted him with her life, and he felt a profound, aching love for her. But he also felt a fear he hadn't known was still inside him, the fear of losing someone, of opening his heart only to have it ripped away again. He sat on the stool opposite her, the firelight flickering between them, illuminating the unsaid. "The arrowhead," he began, his voice rough. "The hair." She nodded slowly. "They are all that is left of my family. The arrowhead was my brother's, the hair, my mother's." The words were quiet, but they hit him like a physical blow, a full-blown massacre, not just a raid, a systematic slaughter. He could only imagine the pain, the terror she had lived through, the reason she was so quick to fight, so wary of trust. He thought of his own loss, a single partner, and it seemed so small, so insignificant compared to hers. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, a silent apology for his foolish fear, for his smallness. She squeezed his hand, her gaze a steady, unwavering light in the darkness. "I had a purpose," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "Before, to find my sister." She was taken by Malachi's men. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The reason for her flight, the reason for her resilience, the reason for the fire in her eyes. It was not just survival, it was a desperate, burning mission. "I am a man of the earth, Elijah. I believe in the sacred. We were not meant to be here, to be trapped by this past. We have to go, we have to find her." She wasn't asking, she was telling him. She was a warrior, a woman of purpose, and he was no longer a man of solitude. Their future, a moment ago, a quiet domestic bliss, had now been shattered and replaced with a new, dangerous purpose. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and he knew what he had to do. He would go with her. He would fight with her. He would help her find what was left of her family, because now her family was his. It was a new chapter, a new path, a new kind of cowboy love story. It was a Wild West love story that was no longer about finding sanctuary, but about creating justice, about reclaiming a stolen life. Their journey was not over. It was just beginning. And in the quiet of the cabin, with the firelight dancing on their faces, two survivors, one haunted by loss, the other driven by purpose, made a silent promise to each other. They would face the unknown, not as two individuals, but as one. The world was wide and dangerous, but they had each other. And that was all that mattered. The road ahead was long, fraught with peril and uncertainty, but as they looked out the broken window at the vast, star-filled sky, they felt a sense of freedom, a sense of healing, a sense of a future that was wide and open, waiting for them. It was a future they would build together, one step at a time, 1 mile at a time, on a quest for the ultimate redemption. Their story, a Wild West love story, had just become a legend, a testament to the power of a cowboy love stories that blossomed from the ashes of pain, a true Wild West love story for the ages. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.